So my name's Chris Evans. I'm going to start now, and it's going to be a little bit of a stretch of the imagination as you're looking at a large piece of bread rather than a piece of work. I took it a little bit too seriously when the one no work thing edict came out. So yeah, I'm going to talk very briefly about one piece of work, and then hopefully lead into a conversation pretty quickly from that. And the piece of work was called "A Needle Walks into a Haystack," and it was made for the last Liverpool Biennial. On being invited to the Liverpool Biennial, I asked about how the Biennial was funded. One of the main sponsors for Liverpool Biennial is a high-end jewellery company, a luxury jewellery company called Boodles. Boodles make jewellery for the royal family, and they make jewellery for the A-listers. It's kind of a very expensive kind of bling. It's not, it's every little square millimeter there's a high expensive piece of jewellery on it, a diamond on it, a sapphire, Helidor, and so forth. So I went down to the Boodles showroom because they were originally from Liverpool and obviously have showrooms elsewhere. I went down to their showroom and I looked through the window at the jewellery, and the security guard kind of came up to me on the other side of the window and looked at me. And so I kind of continued around the showroom looking at the jewellery, and the guy just kind of like followed me around on the inside. So I thought the only way I'm going to get inside this showroom was to make a piece of work. And so I decided to give my commission for the Biennial in a way, in a kind of conduit of a way, to them. So I gave them the brief. As a brief for them to make a piece of work for the Biennial, I gave them the press release, which I'll quickly read out a little excerpt from. "A Needle Walks into a Haystack" is an exhibition about our habits, our habitats, and the objects, images, relationships, and activities that constitute our immediate surroundings. It is about affecting larger questions facing contemporary life and art from an intimate and tangible scale that's within everyday reach. The artists in this exhibition disrupted many of the conventions and assumptions that usually prescribe the way we live our lives. They attacked the metaphors, symbols, and representations that make up their own environment, replacing them with new meanings and protocols. Bureaucracy becomes a form of comedy. Silence becomes a type of knowledge. Domesticity becomes a place of pathology, and inefficiency becomes a necessary vocation, and delinquency becomes a daily routine. So it's quite difficult to talk to Boodles about the language that's used in this press release, especially when it came to that last bit about delinquency becoming a daily routine, because this was the last thing that they really want to do. When I spoke to the owner, Nicholas Wainwright, who's on his yacht doing his, picking up his kids from school, I explained the project to him, and he said, "What's in it for me?" And I said, "Well, it's a chance to do something that you wouldn't normally do." And he said, "But why would I want to do that?" So this conversation was a complete disaster, complete catastrophe. I got off the phone and that's it. But fortunately, one of the members of staff at Liverpool Biennial had this amazing ability to pick up the phone, get him on the phone when he wasn't doing the school run on the yacht, and basically told him off. Just told him off. Just said, you can't behave like that. Anyway, going to cut a long story short. If we imagine that this is the piece of work, which is obviously not, this is more like the Biennial, and the two pieces of butter are the visitors. The piece of work is a piece of bread here, if we imagine that. It's a tablet that I made out of jesmonite, some very gentle imprints of tissue boxes, boots, 3. And then the ring that they made as a response to this press release is placed in the middle of that. And a contract was drawn up so that this piece of work was a composite of the jesmonite tablet, the vitrine that it's shown in, and the ring, that it can never be sold as a ring within this contract for a year at that first instance, and that it could travel around like this or be sold as this composite. So just very briefly, if I'm taking the money that would normally go to the Biennial in its support, and they put that money rather than into the Biennial directly into making a piece of ring for the Biennial, there's some kind of like strange loop that's going on there. And for me, as I read out this press release again, it just reminds me kind of how amped up things are, how amped up things need to be, because it's a way of being excited about the project, excited about the work, and conscious of the audience that this is going to. And a remit of the biennial, like most biennials, has to be that there is some form of kind of democratization of culture. It has to sell itself on this in order to get the funding from the city or from that country. And in a way, I thought that there was a strange thing about the way that Boodles operate, in that they ostensibly appear like they are democratizing luxury jewelry. It's because it's the type of jewelry that appears in Hello magazine. So I was kind of interested in considering how an audience might deal with this or consider this, that kind of strange collusion between this democratization of luxury ostensibly and the democratization of culture ostensibly with the biennial. So this ring, I've just about finished, this ring went around for a year to various galleries, some commercial, some otherwise, and on part of its route it went to Praxis and was seen within a very different context. And we had a conversation at the time, and maybe nice to kind of like continue that now, as to what happens when you take it out of that context and place it in the structure that Praxis operates with.
Yeah, we will actually not answer that question right now, Chris. No, I will not. But just backtrack a tad to invite you all into what Praxis is about, and then I think we should come back to Boodles and the ring, because of course that did become a core to our process with Chris. But Kristine and I founded Praxis about 3 years ago, first as an institutional endeavor in Berlin, where we ran for about 2 years, and then now we're actually on to our second chapter. So we've abandoned the institution, the White Cube space, and we are now operating in Bergen as part of a triennial. So we're coming back to the biennial problem, and we're dealing with that right now. And so in a way, in your sort of response to the amped up rhetoric of the biennial, the need for a particular sort of vast, accelerated, massive punch, I think Kristine and I started thinking about Praxis. And Praxis is I would call it a no-brainer, because what we do, and there's a little choir saluting that, what we do is basically we work with very few artists for a longer time. In Berlin, we worked with 2 artists for half a year, 2 unassociated positions, so we didn't try to do a kind of dual exhibition, but much rather we investigated the 2 practices alongside each other. And we do that by way of modular exhibitions, events, and publications. So in essence, we try to not privilege either of the 3 legs, which actually turned out to be rather difficult in the institutional context. So that's a question, but maybe that will be easier not to in the biennial context. Let's see about that. And yeah, so two artists for half a year. We call the half year cycles. And in Berlin, we operated for 2 years. So we had 4 cycles, a total of 8 artists that we presented. And now we're on to the next. So we're working in the context of the Bergen Assembly. And with that, we've actually decided to stretch the modularity to a full year. I think that resonates with some of the things that's been said previously today in terms of long-term relationships and working together for 12 years. And of course, one of the things we wanted to privilege here was that this became part of a continuous conversation, and that the the experience transferred from 2006 to 2014 with you, Wendelin, and Emily, could in a way be sort of thinking of that as a kind of a structural element of the institution by making that a kind of a sort of grounding pattern, you could say.
So Chris came to us in the what was it, the fourth cycle that we had, at a point where it was clear to us that we were working within, and somebody already mentioned today this idea of a practice as an expanded field, and it certainly was at Praxis, because we looked at existing works and went backwards, but we also looked at unfinished proposals and archive materials and collaborations that sort of went haywire, and models and sketches and everything that sort of somehow belongs to this time span of work and works that you can consider a practice today. And what happened was at Praxis that we decided to give ourselves a real challenge when we met you. As you can tell from this example that Chris just talked about with the ring, he already knows a lot about curatorial processes. He knows a lot about how organizations works, and he's completely aware of how language is developed and used within an institution, as many artists are today. Let's not pretend that it's completely separate entities here. But for us, it was a very interesting time to somehow bring him in and to look at this practice that also has a lot of elements that are not seen that are not presented to the public, simply because we also need a little bit of a challenge in understanding how this institution that we had built was actually operating. What was sort of the restraints that we were working up against without actually understanding it? And I think this has always been the way that we've worked. Again, to lean a little bit on what you said before, sort of trying to present artists and ourselves with obstacles in a way. Just block the process in an interesting way, so that, and it sounds extremely obvious in a way when we are talking about it. We were also talking about this yesterday, that becomes very difficult to explain, because in a way it's quite a natural process that you set out, you start working, and then you hope for something to happen, but you don't quite know what it is, and you actually want it to move along in a direction that you can't quite control, as you were talking about. And why is that so strange? Because this is how we work in a lot of our natural relationships in our families, with our friends. Over the years, there's different kinds of intensities, and you meet and you lose track of each other again. So why is this not the natural, so to speak? Why is this not the obvious way of working in art institutions? And there's many reasons for this. We've talked about this extensively, Rhea and I, this sort of professionalism that has been introduced in all of our lives through art academies and universities, through institutions somehow growing so fast that it's difficult to control, and so you set up all these rules of how to deal with the press, how to deal with events, how to separate, as you're saying, how to separate different things into different boxes. And again, and of course, the ultimate problem becomes then, what kind of artist can you present? What kind of artist can you speak to? It seems like in our work previously in different institutions that there are just a lot of artists that we couldn't actually have the kind of conversations with that we wanted to, because they would be musicians and writers and painters, and that was a problem for the institution, because you had to somehow choose a leg. Or the idea of the retrospective, where you have to have everything, you have to present everything. And that's ridiculous as an argument when you look at most artistic practices that go in so many different directions. So what happened was that we came up with this long list of artists that we really wanted to work with, and that we simply didn't have the opportunities to work with in the way that we wanted in the institutions where we worked. So that's just to sort of say where the idea of creating Praxis came from, and why Chris was so interesting to us at this particular point.
Yeah, so setting up obstacles, and definitely also maybe at a point where Praxis had run for 3 cycles, and we were on to the 4th. And if we may have actually sort of thought of ourselves as coming, we were sort of coming to a moment where Praxis as a white cube operation might even be sort of at a moment of sort of instituting itself, where there were particular patterns reoccurring. Which wasn't the idea, because the idea was to have, as you were saying, like clean slate, tabula rasa, and then from the artistic practice to try and build up a structure meeting that particular utterance or materialism or whatnot. And so Chris posed the obvious problem in a way, being the sort of working sort of counterintuitively towards or against the sort of institutional magnitude, and sort of in doing that, in a way, he'd already done what we were looking for, and that was sort of difficult. And how should we then work with him? So we sat down and we thought, and we talked to him, and we did studio visits and whatnot, and then in the end, and now I really can't. I'm not really sure who kind of came up with this, but in the end, we decided to create a modularity, because every modularity for each artist would be different. The timing of the exhibition and onwards would be different. Came up with a modularity that was completely problematic to any idea of progress, because we decided to have 4 exhibitions, or 3 exhibitions and an outdoor project, and the 3 exhibitions within Praxis, the ground floor space, would be called Hat, and the 4th outdoor piece was then Uniform, which of course sort of negated any idea that we would actually accumulate knowledge here and there would be like a profound engagement with the audience. It sort of bounced back any idea that that there would be that this would be easy to communicate or to explain, and then I don't know how much we should go into the sort of separate parts, but maybe we should come to the Boodles part, because then actually what happened on top of that was that the second hat then was broken into a series. So as you could sort of hear with this piece, Chris' modus operandi, at least as we analyzed it, bases itself on a particular sort of call and response. There's a call, Boodles responded, and then it comes back to the Liverpool biennial, who potentially has another respondent, and here we roll. So in the second hat, we had actually divided what should have just been one exhibition, and that was terrible, into 3 exhibitions. And when I say terrible, it's because, yes, we are both directors and janitors, and we also became Chris' roadies in this case, because not only did we actually create a call and response structure, but Chris is a musician, has been for many years, a great bass player, and he proposed to play with different constellations for the opening or the midst of whatever these different parts. So actually, it's sort of this call and response took over in a way. We hadn't thought of that being a kind of a live moment as well, so it completely rolled in over Praxis and inhabited our time immensely for those weeks.
When we were talking about what we were going to discuss, the term institutional mannerism came up. You're responsible for that, Rhea. And I was curious about that, because it seemed that something, obviously we're not talking about a bridge between the Renaissance and Baroque, we're talking about something that's mannered or habitual, but there's something about that word that has a sense of it that it's excessive, or it's forced, maybe even forced or stylized. What is it that attracted you to that word?
Oh well, I think that I think part of what became very clear at Praxis was that, and I think that sort of, and that to talk about Praxis in that very sort of directed way is quite stupid, because it's not really how it happened. It was different to whenever we worked with the different artists. But to talk about Praxis when we worked together, I think it became very clear that by, in a way, taking cue from your practice, but also by...
Are you saying that my work is mannered?
No, but I'm saying that it's very institutionally mirroring. And I think that mirror in terms, and us using that as a cue, that became quite institutionally mannered. Does that make sense?
I think, no, I mean, I like the way that you said it, because I think there is something about the way that Praxis operates that can be quite difficult for artists in a way, in that it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, in that you're perhaps at times pulling apart or highlighting elements of the structure of how people make work and drawing attention to them rather than to perhaps what that piece of work might do if it's just left to its own, intent by itself. So there is something mannered in that, and that's why I was drawn to the word that you came up with for that.
Sure, and I think, but just to, so to continue that thought, I think that the mannerism or the institutional mannerism here becomes sort of dual-headed. In the one sense, it becomes, yes, a kind of uncomfortable potential of, looking particularly in, and maybe in a different way at particular artworks. But I also think that the fact that we so clearly, or the fact that it became so clear that it was an institutional mannerism, that it kind of played itself. It was a way of showing to the, you could in a way say that it's a way of showing to the institutional structures that are, in a way, you could say, sort of unavoidably subjectivized. Or you could at least ask as to whether they are objective. And by making them mannered, or sort of mannering them in this case, it became very clear that they are in part, a kind of an automated generative process that are sort of both uncontrollable and really potentially great as obstacles.
I think Emily said something quite interesting before about how the institutions that you work with, if you allow it, if everybody allows it in the situation, of course institutions take flavor a lot from the people that are involved, and in particular from the artists that are involved. And I think considering that we worked together for such a long time, I think I have to say that Chris Evans, you got the institution you deserve. There was an element of parody, but it's also a way of coming up with a different kind of critique, a different way of creating. We always talk about this idea of dependencies within institution, who gets what from whom, and this is exactly the kind of conversation that you're trying to avoid, which I quite like about this day. But we like to think about this sort of the flow of intimacy. So you always have these sort of intimacies that you are somehow, you're closer to something at certain points in over a long period of time. At some points we've been closer to particular parts of your process, and that has influenced everything that we do. Then you go away because you have 12,000 other exhibitions to attend, and we're left alone with the work for quite a long time, and it's wonderful. And then something happens, and everything we do is somehow influenced by having this work in the middle. Then you bring in your friends to play the bass, and then that, there's it is actually very close to how we work in other relationships, as I was saying before. That you take flavor, but there's also a chance of making that into a shift of roles, like you do in your family, as you figure out how to go from being a child to being, taking care of your old parents and so forth. But also this idea that you can gently be a parody and a critique and then slide out. And what I quite liked about the situation that we set up, not just with you, but also with you, is that in this institution, I don't have to be the advocate of the institution or of the work. I can somehow, maybe also because we created this triangular shape, I can from time to time say I'm not that interested in this particular constellation, but I can totally allow that it happens and it's fine and we can all learn from it. Or you can say I'm not completely comfortable with this direction, but let's give it a try. Or we say we'd really like to show this airbrush painting that you did, and why can't we get our hands on it, and where is it? And then we never commissioned people because we never had the kind of money that we could commission new works. And we also thought within the span of 6 months, that's really a lot to ask of an artist. And already there's all these biennials and whatnot asking artists to just come up with new stuff. So we thought, okay, this is one thing we're not going to do. And that means that the artists often come up with it themselves. Well, let me make a new airbrush paintings on your windows towards the street, so that we have all the local crowds in Kreuzberg wondering if it was some sort of a, like a nail salon, something like that. It's really nice. So this is really something I find quite intriguing, that if you stop asking for certain things, then they happen sometimes, like they do in your families. And that you can somehow change roles and be both, it's sort of a strange way of massaging out a different kind of critical discourse, I think.
Maybe just to sort of hang on to the moment of Chris airbrushing on the window of praxis. Maybe I was just sort of thinking of that as a good example of sort of highlighting institutional mannerism in our process, because I think that that what happened was that after having looked at Chris's practice for a very long time, we as Praxis came up with this idea of showing all of his airbrushes together. And this doesn't sound so radical, but if you know Chris's work, it's kind of radical, because Chris's airbrushes are always, I could say, sort of considered applications or posters for something to happen. So they're not really work in themselves. A little bit like I think you can ask whether the ring is a work, is a piece. But I think so the application, after sort of thinking a lot about how Chris turns over the institutions and makes them very productive, we thought a lot about how to maybe make the institution productive to him. So in a way, by turning those applications into a real painting show, potentially that could be productive. And of course, that's something that could only happen because there were more modules to come. So there would be presentations much more sort of reliant on an exhibition history that Chris carried. But certainly that became sort of a mannered institutional moment, and then actually, as Kristine said, prompted you, Chris, to then also do actually one of the airbrushes that had disappeared on our storefront windows.
Obviously, as you can hear, the model of Praxis is not, of course, made in a vacuum. It stands on the shoulders of tons of different kinds of artist projects and free academies and whatnot. But more than anything else, of course, on artistic practices that are already doing, to a large extent, what we were interested in doing, presenting themselves in different ways and somehow craving to have contradictions or allowing contradictions throughout a longer time span. It's just to say that we really stand on the shoulders of a lot of different projects, and I think a little bit along what Adam was saying in the very first session we had today, I think it is, in a way, what makes an institution interesting today is this idea that you allow yourself to become a tool, and that you somehow, over a process, you're different kinds of tools, and this takes time. And the same way that developing this sort of work that you're making takes a very, very long time. And so that is what I really find to be a lack in most curatorial situations, is simply this expanse of time where you can allow these things to come into play.
Do we open it up to questions?
Yeah. I'm interested in how you describe this long-term engagement, though, because it was crossing my mind in our depictions of long-term engagements that maybe there's a kind of negative thing that might happen. Maybe we're building consensus. Maybe we're just making a lot of in-jokes. Maybe it becomes mannerist. It folds in on itself. So that you're building in this kind of slight opposition, this slight criticality, this triangulated space to step away perhaps from certain elements and back in again, I think kind of answers a bit that question that I started having in my mind, but maybe you can speak further to that.
Luckily, it's not a studio visit, so we do have audiences, believe it or not. And what happens when you have 6 months is that the people who are coming in over 6 months will come because they're interested in Chris's work, and they will maybe not at the first opening have something to say, but they might have something to say on the third opening. And I've never had this experience in an institution that I worked in before, that people would actually have that kind of time to come up and say, and interestingly enough, they always come to me with their complaints, and they always come with all the praise to Rhea. So they would come up and say, you know, what you showed in the first exhibition I really didn't like, and I'm a musicologist, and I know everything about this, that, and whatnot. So how come you didn't talk about this? And then we still have the time to say, that's fantastic, why don't you come and give a talk? And this is very often how we've generated not only that, but it has also informed the exhibitions coming after that. So luckily we're not working in a complete vacuum. On the other hand, I have to say I don't mind that there's a certain amount of falling into weird lacunas that are maybe only for 10 people, or has a sort of in-joke quality, because as long as the stretch is long enough, that's okay too. I don't want to work in an institution where everything is for everyone. So I think this is not how all institutions should work, but I think there is a need for these sort of places where you can digress and go in crazy directions, and then you come back, and then so maybe you're right. Maybe there is an element of in-joke, but hopefully there's also room for all the other stuff along the way. Did you ever feel like you were outside the joke, Chris Evans?
No. I think this may be something to be said. I don't know how we are for time, but yeah. I was just going to bring it up about you know, what has to remain unsaid and what can be said with regards to how I go about my work and how that might be projected through an institution, and how I always have to be kind of careful so it doesn't appear in any way that I'm being exploitative of somebody who I'm working with, and I often have to pay heed to make sure that they feel like, you know, they're complicit in something. And with the way that you work, in a way, sometimes the method that you go about showing artists' work is not necessarily derived from the object itself, is it? As Gregory mentioned earlier, but it's to try to find some kind of tangent off that. And the risk of that tangent might be that it exposes a structure of how somebody works where they would otherwise keep quiet about it. They don't want to reveal it. There's a lot that needs to go unsaid. But I was interested in the risk of this, in the risk of working with you, because I knew that that's how you operated, and the things that might kind of appear in the cracks with kind of exposing a structure to how one might work in an overt manner.
Maybe we can ask if anybody in the audience has any questions for Kristine or Rhea.
Hello, thank you for the talk, and I really appreciate the practice of praxis. But then I was just wondering whether there have been perhaps situations of, let's say, rejection from the side of the artist or a collaborator that you invite for the sake of the same reasons that you maybe emphasize as, you know, the good ones, let's say the long-term engagement. That could be that sometimes someone is not really into engaging for such a long term because it really takes a lot of responsibility for both sides, and
yeah, definitely. I mean, we've talked to, of course, artists that were not interested in being part of this process. I think what we've tried to be more, I think that getting to know this entity better ourselves, or this methodology better ourselves, I think it's also very clear that we're not interested in looking at the sort of the artistic practice as something sort of dead and, you know, curatorially looking at it from the outside. We're kind of thinking of that exhibition moment as productive, which means that for that to be productive, which is, I guess it is for most artists traveling around doing their shows and then taking on all the curatorial and artistic knowledge that comes out of that and putting that into the next show, to have that happening within the institution demands of the artist to be, to a particular extent, part of this, of course. So there's actually a quite high demand in terms of involvement. And I try to sort of, at the beginning, I think we used some quite potentially dangerous tropes of, slowing down, de-acceleration. And I think that kind of terminology it is true. There is a long-term focus, but it's not necessarily completely without a pace, no? And if you're put on the spot for a long time, Judith Hopp, who lived around the corner when we did a cycle with her, was like continuously embarrassed about this. Like, kind of loved it and hated it, because she had 4 shows throughout spring 2014, and we invited all of the subscribers to the mailing list, but that included her friends. And so there's been that kind of sort of awkward moments, rejections, all of that. I think one of the things that's interesting here with all of that is that it becomes we don't gloss over it. Actually, it can become potentially useful. At least it's there. And I think with most exhibitions, of course, you work and work and work, and you have a sort of 3-month, like, super intense run-up, and then you go in all directions. And with some people, you sort of you establish good relationships, and you continue working. With other people, you never see each other again. There's no, in that sense, responsibility. And what obviously happened at Praxis is that responsibility is just there, because you wake up next morning with hangover, and then you talk about the next show. And I think that that's really interesting in the sense that of course, puts up very, very different parameters of how to work together.
Great. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much to Praxis and to Chris for coming in, and to all of our speakers today, and to say that there will be a special performance by Charlemagne Palestine, who's currently exhibiting with us at 6 o'clock, 1 floor up. So do join us for that also. Thank you.